Good evening, Professor Michael Sandel. This is Myungnim Park from Gwangju. First of all, thanks so much for accepting our suggestion to have this kind of the congratulatory remarks and conversation for the 40th anniversary of the Gwangju Democratic Movement. Thank you so much again.
It's my pleasure to be with you, and it's for me a special honor to be part of this forum celebrating the life and the work and the contributions to democracy of President Kim Dae-jung, who was one of the great champions of democracy and human rights. He set an example for the world. He was really, I think, one of the leading figures of democracy in the second half of the 20th century. And it's also a special honor to be with you on this 40th anniversary of the May 18th student movement, the democracy movement in Gwangju, which also historically, I think, is important to remember as a lesson in how democracy, which we often take for granted today, is the result of struggle on the part of citizens. And in the case of the May 18th student movement, it involved sacrifice by citizens and especially by students. But the example they set, the courage they displayed, led the way to the democracy that South Korea and much of the world enjoys and admires today. So it's a pleasure really to be part of this forum that celebrates these two great moments in the democratic experience of the second half of the 20th century.
Yes, Professor Michael Sandel, you already said the meanings, the several important meanings of Gwangju Democratic Movement and the lives of President Kim Dae-jung. Yes, in addition, then I'd like to ask you some different question. Many scholars said the demise of democracy or the critical crisis of democracy in the world. Now, at the moment, what's the meaning of that kind of democratic movement or democratic leadership, including Gwangju and also Kim Dae-jung and others, under the current situation of democratic crisis at the moment in the world?
I think the democratic crisis we are facing today in countries throughout the world
Yes.
Can only be addressed by the coming together of two great sources of democratic strength. One of them is leadership, and the other has to do with citizens engaging in the kind of social movement and civic activism that make democracy a reality, which is why the example of the leadership of Kim Dae-jung is important to remember because it can be a source of inspiration. But leaders alone, important though they are not enough. Equally important is the commitment of citizens to the ideal of democracy. And that's why the May 18th democracy movement is equally important to remember as a source of inspiration.
Yes.
Because it demonstrates the importance, beyond even the best leaders, of citizen activism to keep alive the hope and the aspiration for democracy. I think that today we are seeing democracy in trouble
Yes.
in many countries around the world. And that's partly a failure of leadership, and it's partly failure of democratic citizens to demand something better, a better kind of politics than the kind that has become all too familiar in democratic societies around the world.
As you said, under that kind of situation in the world, now, when we remember the leaders in the previous century, I think we could remember the legacies of some so prominent leaders, including President Kim Dae-jung, Willy Brandt,
Yeah.
and Nelson Mandela. They were all the Nobel Peace Prize laureates. Also representative leaders in East Europe, Africa, and Asia. What kind of legacies or wisdom or leadership we may learn from those kinds of great leaders under this kind of situation?
I like very much, Dr. Park, what you emphasized in your talk just now about the spirit of reconciliation and the overcoming of differences,
Yes.
and also courage. All three of these leaders displayed remarkable courage. They also faced up to hard and difficult memories of suffering and of oppression, of authoritarianism, even of tyranny. And they kept the memory of that hard history alive, even as they struggled to help their societies overcome it. And so remembering the past, not forgetting it, and yet approaching the future in a spirit of reconciliation is something that the three leaders you mentioned had in common. They both led by seeking to reconcile and to reconcile differences and even to forgive great wrongs. And this is a demanding test of leadership. So I think that's one important set of virtues that the three leaders you mentioned had in common.
Yes. The most serious problem at the moment in the world facing the so-called COVID-19 pandemic disaster, I think the most serious problem is we cannot find any kind of global leadership to unite the world citizens and the countries in order to challenge, to cope with this kind of so critical crisis. I think that's one of the most serious problems.
Yes, one feature of the challenge posed by COVID is that it's a pandemic, and so it requires a global response. After all, the challenge, the threat of the virus, it's a pandemic. And yet the response that we have seen is not really a response of global cooperation. If anything, the COVID-19 crisis has led to a reversal of tendencies toward global cooperation. It's led nation states to look inward, to close their borders, because it seems that citizens in moments of crisis like this seek the protection and the security of their countries. And this can sometimes come at the cost of ignoring global cooperation. There's a second challenge posed by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is within countries. We often tell ourselves we are all in this together since the virus came. We are all in this together. We are all mutually dependent. And yet, the virus came, the pandemic arrived at a time of deep polarization and deep inequalities within countries. It's certainly true in my country over the past 4 decades. The gap between rich and poor has grown wider and wider. And I'm aware that in South Korea, there is also a debate about the widening inequalities of recent years. And these inequalities that we are struggling with, here I'll speak of the United States, these inequalities have undermined the solidarity, the sense of common purpose, the sense of mutual responsibility for one another that we need to confront the virus. Now, we have special problems. I think we could learn something from South Korea's success in handling the crisis. South Korea, I think, has had more cooperation by citizens than we in the United States. In the United States, we're still having a debate about wearing masks as a way of reducing the spread of the virus. Many people in the US are complaining that they don't want to be told to wear a mask. We also don't have as much testing and contact tracing as you have had in South Korea. And so the death per capita in the United States has been far, far greater than in South Korea. This is partly for reasons of the lack of leadership that we've had, but it also, I think, has to do with the need to summon a greater sense of community, of mutual responsibility for one another, a sense of the common good. And I think we do have something to learn from the success of South Korea in dealing with this crisis.
Thank you so much for your remarks on the success of our country. The related question is, in case of the leaderships of Kim Dae-jung and Mandela and Willy Brandt, first of all, they succeeded in uniting their people under the banner of some values, critical values of humankind: justice, democracy, equality, freedom, or any other universal value. But in order to struggle for those kind of value, they accepted and also subdued. As you said, how can you say that kind of wound or situation of victimization in the process of achieving that kind of universal value?
Well, it's certainly true that the examples, these 3 great leaders, inspired people to come together around certain values, certain ethical ideals, human rights, democracy, the common good. But to do that, to achieve that, they require great courage and physical sacrifice. In reading about President Kim Dae-jung, I learned about the fact that there were a number of attempts on his life, attempts to assassinate him, including in 1973 when he was kidnapped from a hotel in Tokyo and was taken on a boat and only at the last minute was saved, but then he was put under house arrest. Another time, after he ran for president against General Park, he was driving a car and was in a terrible traffic accident that was likely a deliberate attempt to kill him. The students and the citizens in May 18th in Gwangju, many of them sacrificed their lives for the cause of democracy. A number of them were killed, hundreds injured, for the sake of pressing for democracy. So the values that you described, the values of democracy and human rights, we often take these values for granted. And we need to remember the struggle. We need to remember the courage. We need to remember the sacrifice and the suffering that was necessary to make democracy and respect for human rights possible. And that's why it's so important that the educational system teach young people these stories, including the story of May 18th. And actually, I have a question, Dr. Park, for you. I've read that in South Korea, recently there's been some disagreement about how the textbooks should teach the events of May 18th and the democracy movement. It seems to me that's a very important historical moment to keep alive in the memory of young people and in the history books. How is that viewed today? How is that taught to young people in school in Korea?
Your question is very important to us. As a divided country, still the ideological confrontation in South Korea, even about the topics of domestic issue, democracy, human rights, welfare, economic equality. Some ultra-rightist group, they try to stigmatize any kind of this kind of progressive development of South Korea, stigmatize as a pro-North Korea or Komi policy or red-ridden policy. Then I think this is one of the very serious hurdle we must cope with in the long process of democratization of this country. Yes, needless to say, being from the institutional level, we are one of the representative democratic country, but in the scale, in the way, or in the some touch to deal the ideological issue or value issue or some sort of making compromise between the different political groups, ideologies, I think still so far to go we are facing. Then I think that kind of distortion of history, including May 18th democratic movement and any other democratic movement, I think we must cope with based on the democratic citizen education or some sort of discussion, conversation in the public sphere.
Yes.
It needs some more time, I think.
Well, I find this fascinating because we've been discussing democracy and democratic values, and that leads directly to the subject of education. How young people are told the story of the history of democracy in their society. And because democracy is not just a procedure, democracy is a set of values. Because of this, values can be controversial. People can disagree about how to interpret the past. And those interpretations make a difference to the way we understand democracy today. I think it's important that we address these disagreements openly and honestly in the public sphere, in public debate, and in debate about what to teach young people. In my country, we are experiencing a similar debate about the values, but also about the history, the story of democracy in our country. You may have read about the current debate and social movement about Black Lives Matter, about racial justice and injustice.
Yes.
And this is a debate. It's a debate about democracy. It's a debate about values. And it's a debate about the past, about history and how to teach it. So the fact that you are having this debate in South Korea, including about the legacy of the May 18th democracy movement,
Yes.
if that debate can continue openly in the public sphere, and if that debate can shape values, then I think that's one of the important resources for democracy. That's a sign of an open society, that there can be an attempt to debate the values that democracy requires. Democracy is facing hard times, but if we have a lively, active public sphere where we can debate the importance of democratic values and of human rights, that I think is important to education. It's important to the meaning of democratic citizenship.
We may have some different views, different interpretation of some historical incident, but we must accept, agree, and recognize the fundamental values and the key historical fact and truths. We must not distort by ideological stigmatization or ideological personal or group belief system. I don't think at all that in case of May 18th democratic movement, the key value of that movement is to achieve democracy, human rights, and also human emancipation, citizen solidarity. Then without recognizing those kind of fundamental values of the incident,
I think that you're having the Kim Dae-jung Museum and Library
yes,
is an important public, cultural, educational institution to keep this historical memory alive so that especially young people, all citizens, but especially young people, can have the opportunity to learn about these important events in the democratic experience and history of South Korea.
yes. There are many institutions of the Kim Dae-jung and Gwangju Democratic Movement in Gwangju City area in order to teach the next generation. As you said, based on those kind of victims, sacrifice, agony, and contribution, now the next generation, including us, we may enjoy the high level of high quality of democracy. So how could you think that kind of victims or agonies or sacrifice can interpret as a wounded healer or healing or wounded victims, or as Goethe and Hegel emphasized many times, rose cross with so many roses what do you think of this kind of interpretation?
I think it's important to keep alive these voices, including the voices and the history and the experience of those who suffered, those who sacrificed, and their loved ones, because out of this sense of suffering and sacrifice comes a deeper appreciation of the values that the participants in these events were seeking to bring about. And remembering their story and their sacrifice and their suffering deepens our own appreciation of the democratic institutions we have today. Democracy today, we often think, is just a matter of voting on election day. But it is so much more than that. Of course, voting is very important. But voting is the last act in the drama of democracy. What really matters is the civic life, the civic activism, the discussions and debates in the public sphere, in public forums, the arguments and debates among citizens who may disagree about policy or about equality and inequality, about the redistribution of income. There will be disagreements about these questions. But a healthy democracy is not only a society that has the right to vote on election day. It's a society where there is a kind of civic education and public space for ongoing debate and dialogue about values, about big ethical questions that citizens together need to debate and to decide. That is a demanding project. And it is certainly a project that the student movement of May 18th and the life of Kim Dae-jung were dedicated to. But reminding ourselves of their experience is a way of reminding ourselves what an achievement, and sometimes a fragile achievement, democracy is. And if they made those sacrifices, then surely we can devote a little more time and a little more effort and a little more public education to making sure that their legacy, their democratic legacy, is deepened and preserved.
Yes, and needless to say, you are the top scholar of justice. Then I think in case of Kim Dae-jung and Willy Brandt and Mandela, they never gave up any time the banner of justice and democracy, human rights. But in their personal life, they try to embrace really wide range of their enemies and try to accomplish the highest level of the human victory, including reconciliation, solidarity, to embrace former enemies, and to cut up any kind of racial differentiation or differences or regional antagonism. Then how can we try to coexist or try to push those kind of two critical values, justice and reconciliation? It is really hard, I think, job to all kinds of politicians. But they succeeded, Kim Dae-jung, Willy Brandt, and Mandela.
Well, they did succeed. And I think what your question suggests is that there can be a tension between justice on the one hand and forgiveness or reconciliation on the other. For example, I've read that Kim Dae-jung pardoned General Chun. Is that right? And this must not have been an easy thing to do. And I'm sure many people felt that this pardon was inconsistent with justice. But sometimes, in order to heal divisions and to heal the scars and the pain and the wounds of the past, sometimes it's necessary to achieve the kind of reconciliation that may not involve insisting on punishing people who have done wrong, who have committed injustice. And how to make that decision that's a difficult, challenging choice to make. But the three leaders you mentioned all found their way to reconcile with their opponents, and in some cases, their enemies. And that's an unusual human achievement.
Yes. Now, as he said in the first start of this conversation, we are facing under the global pandemic COVID-19 situation. When you remember the legacies of Kim Dae-jung and Gwangju Democratic Movement, I think some microcosmic case or some Poco case in the world, later we may universalize or generalize. Under this kind of situation, at the time, the Gwangju citizen and Kim Dae-jung, under the military dictatorship, they tried to raise the banner of universal human value. Then, in case of the current pandemic situation, how can we learn, or what kind of lessons we can learn from the sacrifices, from the spirit, soul of Kim Dae-jung and Gwangju citizen to the current world citizen?
Well, I think the lesson that we can learn from their example is that confronting big challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic requires a kind of solidarity that is not easy to achieve. One of the reasons that we in my country have not done very well, I'll speak honestly here, we've not done very well in dealing with the pandemic, is that we have not had the kind of strong leadership that brings people together across their differences. Dealing with a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic requires leadership that brings people together, not that divides them. It requires leadership that seeks the common good and that can inspire social solidarity. Because during a pandemic, we are reminded of our mutual dependence on one another. We are also reminded that we have a responsibility for one another. We can't solve this crisis acting only as individuals, seeking to protect ourselves or our family. We can only solve this crisis by working together as national communities and ultimately as a global community. But to work together in this way to address this crisis requires values. It requires a spirit of shared sacrifice. It requires a deep commitment to the common good. These are among the democratic values that this forum celebrates. And so I want to thank you, Dr. Park, and all of those who made this forum possible for reminding us of the importance of these values in addressing the challenges that democracy faces today, just as democracy faced great challenges as it developed over the course of our past. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and I wish you well in this important project of democratic civic education.
Dr. Sandel, thank you so much. So meaningful conversation with us. Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
네, 마이클 샌델 교수님과 박명림 관장님께 다시 한번 뜨거운 박수 보내주시기 바랍니다.